Hello and welcome to DataCast Solutions Introduction to KNIME for the Data Analyst. Hello, in this chapter we're going to take a look at working with JSON and XML. Structured data is certainly going to be one of the most common types of data you get back when you're interfacing with third parties through REST and SOAP APIs. Google, for example, offers both a JSON and XML version of all of their API calls. And so we're going to talk about how to ingest that data in KNIME. All right, I've got a simple workflow here, and I use the table creator instead of actually calling a REST API. I use the table creator node. And if you look at the configuration, I've just put two lines in here that have a JSON body in them, and the data type is JSON. If I double click on the column header here, I can see that there's the value, the name. I'm not going to have any missing value rows here, so I'm just literally just creating data to feed. So when I look at the output of this node, of the manually created table, I've got a JSON data type for my fields. And if I make it bigger, this is actually the result of a Google API call that I pulled in here. And what I want to do is write a KNIME routine to process this, to turn this into a set of columns instead of JSON. So to start with, I'm going to use the JSON, but you notice down here in the bottom, if I do a search on JSON, I can do all types of things. I can combine rows, transform JSON. I can take a table and convert it to JSON. I can convert a string to JSON. I can convert JSON back to a string. I can read or write files that are just JSON. So there's a great deal of services available in KNIME. But the one I'm going to use most clearly right now is the JSON path. So I've already attached the JSON path node here, and I'm going to double click on it to configure it. And it tells me up at the top the input body, what it is I'm actually taking. And down below, it shows me all of the data from the first record. Now this can be a little tricky because sometimes the first record doesn't have all the data fields you might need. So you might have to, for purposes of configuring this node, you may have to use the row filter to pull off a very specific row to configure this. But in my case, I'm going to do two different configurations here. The first one I want to take is I want to gather all of the data that isn't an array, or in KNIME terms, a collection. So like address components, you'll notice there's a whole bunch of address components. And I don't want to pull all these right now. But the fields that aren't repeated as arrays start with the formatted address. So that's a single query. It's not a collection. So I'm going to add that as a single query. Now, if I don't like the name that, in this case, Google has provided me, I can double click on this, and you'll see I can edit this value and say I don't want it to be a string, I want it to be something else. But you can define how the data is going to come back. But I'm going to choose, and maybe in this case I want to call it formatted address without the underscore. That field is now going to be returned back. Now I've also got the geometry, in this case the longitude and latitude, and I want to select them both as individuals. So I'm going to add single queries for latitude, and I'm going to add a query for longitude. And the location type, I'm going to go ahead and extract that field. And I'm going to go ahead and get the place ID that Google gave it. And Google provides me a series of place types. For right now, I'm not going to gather that field, but I do want to get the status back from Google. So I'll go ahead and click that and add a single query. Now, I don't need the JSON string when I'm finished here. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the source column from this workflow. And I'm going to click OK and execute. And now, when I look at the output of this, it's removed the source column, and I've got the formatted address, the latitude, the longitude, the location type, the Google Place ID, and the Google status. So I've extracted everything I wanted off of that JSON string. So very straightforward and simple enough. So the next thing I'd like to do is go and extract the address elements that also came in that JSON string. But those are an array, or in KNIME terms, a collection. So I'm going to highlight this and I'm going to add another JSON path. And this time, I'm going to take these two records and I'm going to highlight the first one of these addresses, even though it occurs multiple times. But instead of adding a single query, I'm going to add a collection query, which now tells KNIME that I want all of them. I want all of these addresses. And again, I don't need to keep the source column, so I'm fine with that. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And when I execute the result of this and look at the table, I now see I have a KNIME collection column instead for all of the address components. And you've seen me use in the collection node the ungroup command. I'm going to take now that collection and take those address components and I'm going to break them down into individual data rows. So now I've got each element here. Make that a little wider, and if I make the row height a little taller, you can see, all right, so there's a long name called subpremise, and there's an element called street number, and the element that has the route, and the neighborhood, which has a type of both political and neighborhood. So you're going to see, by the way, how I manage that when I deal with multiple types that appear for a single value. So, excuse me, let's go ahead now, and now that we've got the ungroup, now let's go ahead and add another JSON path to it and take each of those individual values and let's extract them out and say I want to gather, so I want to take the long name and now the data type, I can try to bring this in. You saw that it brings back multiple values. In my case, I'm going to take the first one. So if there are multiple types, if it's both a subpremise and a political arrangement or a political statement, I only in this case want the first one. So I'm going to take the long name, the short name, or excuse me, the long name and the data type, and that's all I want to pull off of this query. And again, I'm going to remove and execute this. And now I've got the long name and the type of value that it is. And so I can see all of the different address information. And so the next thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to join all this information back together. I'm going to want to connect up the information from here up to here. But I'm missing a key. So that's going to be the next step, is we're going to go back and add something to the key. What I lack right now in this workflow is a common field that I can join these two on. However, if you look here at the original table, there is this row ID. I could use that as my joining key. So I'm going to do a search for the row ID as a node, and I'm going to drop this in between. So before I execute the path, and notice how it set this downstream has to be re-executed. And I'm going to highlight these three nodes, and I'm going to slide them down a little bit. And I'm going to make this connect, which will also reset all of those. So what I'm going to do here is capture the original row ID. And what I want to do in this particular case is I just want to create a new column that has the value of the row ID. And I'm going to call it my original row ID. So now I have a way of joining them, and I'm going to have a way of pivoting them. So I can execute all these nodes one at a time, but I'm just going to go ahead and hit execute all nodes, and it will finish executing all the way downstream. So now I can look at this data, and I've got the original row ID, and all of these are information. So in our last section, we looked at the pivot. a way of aggregating data, and I'm going to pivot this data. So I'll set up the pivot and say on the row ID, and I want to pivot on the type. And for the manual aggregation, I want to take the long name, and I'm going to give it a value of first. I'm going to take the first value. There's only going to be one for each type. That's by definition, since that's the way I extracted the data. So I could take the first one, the last one, it wouldn't matter. Even if it was a list, there's only one value. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK here and look at the output if I execute at the pivot table. So I've now got administrative level area 1 is Minnesota, Hennepin County, United States, Minneapolis, the Midtown Phillips neighborhood, postal code, the apartment or unit number, etc. So I've gathered all this information together. So now let me go ahead and I'm going to add a joiner to this, because I've got the fixed data here that had the original information now, which has the row ID. And I can connect these two together and add a criteria that says I want to join on the original row ID. Now, just in case every record did not have an address, I'm going to do a left outer join. In this case, I know they do, but it doesn't matter. So when I execute my final output now, I've now got the original row ID, and I've extracted the formatted address, the latitude, the longitude, the place ID, as well as all of the individual elements of their address have now all been extracted as one part, one row for each JSON string. Now the final note I'm going to make here, I could walk through the exact same scenario using XML as a data type instead of JSON. But if I do a search for XML, what you'll see is the exact same thing. And the only difference is you're going to be using the X path. So instead of the JSON path, it's the X path. But you have all of the same capabilities. And it works identically. You're going to choose the elements that you want to extract, and you're going to either choose single query or collection queries to extract the data off of XPath. So I'm not going to make you waste your time walking through. It really doesn't matter whether you're using XML or JSON. The method is all the same. So that's what you need to know to handle the structured data that you're going to be working with within KNIME. This concludes this chapter of the class. Feel free to move on to the next chapter.